I'm still not entirely sure how to wrap my head around what happened, but since so many of you have asked me for details, I'm going to lay it all out. My parents always favored my younger sister, and I never expected them to go this far. Whenever I think about how I came home from a 3-month trip to find my car gone, I feel my anger spike. After spending years working, saving, and hustling, I finally took time to travel, something I believed I deserved. I left my car in my parents' driveway, trusting it would stay put. But as soon as I got back, I saw it was missing. At first, I thought maybe they'd moved it, but then my mother casually informed me they'd sold it. Her reasoning was jaw-dropping. They'd used the money to fund my sister's vacation because she was feeling devastated after her divorce. I've always known she was the golden child, but I never imagined they'd outright steal from me for her sake. It wasn't just a few dollars. They forged my signature, ignoring the fact that the title was in my name. They didn't apologize. They felt entitled. My father said I'd hardly been using the car, so what's the harm? I was livid. This wasn't some minor inconvenience, but a blatant violation of trust. I confronted them, and they shrugged it off, telling me I should be supportive of my sister, especially during her heartbreak. I felt betrayed. This was the final straw. I'd always endured their favoritism, but this time, they crossed a line. As I stood there, stunned, I knew I couldn't let this slide. They kept talking about family unity, but they failed to see the hypocrisy. I decided right then I was done bending. If they thought I'd forgive and move on, they were mistaken. This time, I'd fight back legally, financially, and emotionally. That car wasn't just property. It was my independence, my hard-earned asset. I felt the sting of betrayal in my gut, and all I could think was that they'd regret underestimating me. I went to my old bedroom, locked the door, and tried to process everything. They'd effectively robbed me of something I'd worked so hard for. I'd bought that car with my own money, saved from freelancing gigs and late-night shifts. My parents had contributed nothing, yet they felt justified in selling it off like some family heirloom. My sister, of course, was already sunbathing in some tropical spot, posting pictures online of her cocktails and tour packages. It stung to see her smiling while I was left to pick up the pieces of my uprooted life. I'd planned to use that car to commute to a new job opportunity I was pursuing. Now I had to figure out transportation on top of dealing with the emotional fallout of their betrayal. I might have stayed under their roof for a few days after returning, but there was no chance of that now. My father had the nerve to tell me I was overreacting. Overreacting? They sold my car without my permission and forged my name on the paperwork. In what world is that not a crime? Every time I tried to confront them, they fell back on the same tired excuses. She needed a break. She's going through a divorce. We are family. We have to help each other. But apparently, help only flowed in one direction. For years, I'd taken care of my own needs while my sister got endless handouts. I left that night, staying at a friend's place because I couldn't stand another minute in that house. My mother texted me, playing the victim, claiming she couldn't sleep because I was being so harsh. Harsh? I called it reality. I told her I planned to get the authorities involved unless they returned the money immediately. She tried to call my bluff, saying there was no proof I hadn't given them permission. That's when I realized I needed to act swiftly. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I was done trying to reason with people who saw nothing wrong with theft. My friend thought I was brave for taking such a stand, but I was mostly fueled by rage and a sense of justice. It wasn't about vengeance at first. It was about not being a doormat anymore. A few days later, I found out more details about how they'd managed to sell the car. My mother had apparently sweet-talked a local dealership, spinning a story about how I'd gone abroad for longer than expected and needed to offload the vehicle. She forged my signature on the release forms, then pocketed the money. To make matters worse, she'd even bragged to a family friend about her cleverness, telling them my sister deserved every bit of that luxury escape to cheer her up. When I confronted her with this information, she immediately blamed my father, saying he'd been the one to push the sale. My father, in turn, blamed her, claiming he'd just gone along because she said it was already arranged. Their willingness to toss each other under the bus told me everything I needed to know about their moral compass. They were finally scared because I'd mentioned legal consequences. The forging of my signature alone could lead to criminal charges. Still, they kept trying to guilt trip me. My father even said, "You're not going to put your own parents in jail, are you?" As if I was the monster. At that point, I was determined to see this through, but I did weigh my options carefully. Pressing criminal charges against my own parents was heavy, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't tear me up inside. They were the only parents I had, but they were also the ones who'd made a mockery of my trust. I booked another meeting with my lawyer, who advised I document every interaction. So I saved texts, voicemails, and screenshots of my sister's fancy trip posts, evidence they'd spent significant money on her travel. I also reached out to a friend who worked at a financial institution just to get advice on how bank transfers might be traced. My plan was to ensure that every penny they'd received was accounted for. I wanted a clear trail leading back to them. My mother called me in tears when she heard I was being so methodical. She begged me to drop it, offering to pay me back when they could, but I knew they didn't have nearly enough savings to reimburse me, nor did I trust them to keep any promise. The more people I spoke to, the more outraged they were on my behalf. Old classmates and coworkers who heard the story couldn't believe it. A few suggested I post about it online to get advice or even sympathy, but I was wary of airing family drama in public. Deep down, I was still struggling with the emotional impact. Even if my parents had always been biased, I never thought they'd stoop to literal theft. But here I was, dealing with the aftermath. My sister was conveniently unreachable during her vacation, which I assumed was funded by the money they got from my car. Occasionally, I'd see an update on social media, her beaming face at some scenic spot, hashtagging it #new beginnings. I guess she didn't realize her new beginning came at the cost of my property. When she finally did return my call, she acted clueless. She insisted she had no idea how our parents had suddenly afforded to send her on this dream getaway. That infuriated me more because I knew how gullible my parents could be, but my sister wasn't stupid. She had to suspect something was amiss. We argued and she tried to flip it on me saying, "I can't believe you're making a big deal out of this. You know how miserable I've been." I hung up on her. There was no point in reasoning with someone who saw nothing wrong with benefiting from stolen funds. My lawyer eventually helped me draft a letter of demand outlining the amount they owed me for the car's market value, along with potential damages for the forgery. My parents panicked upon receiving it, calling me multiple times. They left desperate voicemails, cycling between anger, guilt, and pleas for forgiveness. But I had no intention of letting them off easy. This wasn't just a spat, it was a serious offense. I told them if they wanted to avoid a civil suit and potentially criminal charges, they'd need to repay me in full within a reasonable time frame and sign an admission of wrongdoing. No more excuses, no more manipulations. My sister started calling me again, claiming she would sell some of her possessions to help pay me back. She wanted me to see that she cared about fixing the situation. I told her I wasn't interested in half-baked measures. If she was truly sorry, she'd have confronted our parents the moment she learned the money for her trip was stolen from me. Instead, she'd happily posted pictures of her fancy spa sessions. She tried to say that her divorce had drained her emotionally, that she needed something to look forward to, as if that justified theft. By then, my mother's texts turned nasty, saying I was tearing the family apart and that my sister didn't deserve to be punished for wanting a bit of happiness. As if my sister's happiness was the only thing that mattered. She even tried to bring up old issues like how I'd always been distant and self-reliant, accusing me of never letting them help me. The irony was painful. They never offered genuine help, only judgments. They'd hoisted every possible excuse for their actions onto me, painting me as ungrateful. My father pulled a different card. He told me he'd ask other family members to talk sense into me. A few relatives did call, urging me to handle this discreetly. Some said, "Your parents are getting old. Do you really want to destroy them?" As if I was the villain. But a surprising number of relatives sided with me, or at least remained neutral. They understood that forging a child's signature and selling their property was indefensible. My parents' circle of defenders shrank as more details emerged. Even those who tried to remain impartial recognized that my parents had crossed a legal boundary. The last straw was when they attempted to shift the timeline, acting like I'd been gone longer than I initially said. I showed proof of my plane tickets, itinerary, and even text messages informing them of my return date. They couldn't keep their lies straight. They were grasping at straws, hoping to discredit me or lessen their guilt. The entire ordeal was exhausting, but my resolve never wavered. I wanted justice, and I was going to get it. Ultimately, the legal route became unavoidable. My parents refused to meet my lawyer's demands, and they wouldn't offer a suitable repayment plan or a written admission. My lawyer suggested we sue for the full value of the car plus damages. He also reminded me that we could, at any point, escalate to criminal charges for the forgery. The thought made my stomach churn, but a part of me felt vindicated. This wasn't some petty squabble. This was a clear violation of law. I moved forward with the civil suit, and my parents were served papers. They called me in a panic, blaming each other for allowing things to go this far. My father tried one last manipulation. "Is this really what you want, to see your parents in court?" I told him I never wanted that, but they'd left me no choice. My sister, caught in the middle, was apparently furious with both of them for not shutting this down sooner. She tried to negotiate on their behalf, offering to mediate. I refused, telling her any conversation needed to go through my lawyer. It was all business now. During this time, I learned from a cousin that my parents were going around telling everyone I was heartless and money hungry. I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them spin a narrative where I was the bad guy for demanding what was rightfully mine. I filed the lawsuit detailing the stolen car, the forged signature, and the emotional distress. The day they received official notice, my father called me in tears for the first time in my life. It rattled me, but I stayed firm. He talked about how he'd lose his reputation, how he might lose his home, and how this would affect their retirement. I told him he should have thought of that before selling my property to fund someone else's vacation. My mother then texted me insisting I was destroying the family legacy and that we'd never recover from this feud. But in my mind, what was there to recover? They had decimated the relationship the moment they decided my sister's trip was more important than my rights. As we headed toward mediation, I felt a mix of dread and satisfaction. My lawyer and I arrived, paperwork in tow. My parents showed up with their own lawyer, looking exhausted. They offered a half-hearted settlement that barely covered half the value of the car and none of the additional damages. My lawyer calmly explained why that wouldn't be acceptable, and we laid out the evidence of their wrongdoing. The mediator tried to see if there was any emotional ground to salvage, but it was clear I wasn't budging on the numbers. My mother burst into tears, accusing me of being cruel and ungrateful. She said everything they'd done was for family. I retorted that forging signatures and stealing was hardly a family value. After hours of back and forth, they finally caved to a better settlement, full reimbursement for my car's fair market value, plus partial coverage of my legal fees. They balked at the idea of paying for emotional distress, but I demanded something to address it. We settled on an additional sum, not huge, but enough to make a statement. My parents were furious, my mother sobbing as she signed. My father stared at me like I was a stranger. In truth, I guess I'd become one. I signed the agreement, ensuring everything was legally binding and that they couldn't back out. Then the mediator asked if anyone wanted to say anything else for closure. I simply said I wanted nothing more from them. My sister tried to approach me, tears in her eyes, but I shook my head. I walked out of that room feeling a strange numbness, as if years of pent-up frustration had finally been released, leaving me both lighter and more hollow than before. In the weeks that followed, news spread among our extended family. Some took my side wholeheartedly, calling my parents out for their blatant theft. Others wrung their hands about how I'd allowed things to escalate, but I knew that was just their discomfort with confrontation. My sister, upon learning the extent of what our parents had to pay, complained to me that she was indirectly suffering because they could no longer bankroll her as they used to. She acted as though I owed her an apology for not letting it slide. It was almost comical. I blocked her after that. I had nothing left to say. My parents transferred the settlement money in increments, following the schedule laid out in the legal agreement. Each transaction felt surreal. They'd stolen from me, and now they were forced to pay me back. My lawyer reminded me that if they missed a payment, we could hold them in contempt of the agreement, potentially pushing for harsher consequences. I felt no satisfaction from imagining them behind bars, but I also felt no urge to protect them if they decided to violate the settlement. Throughout this process, I caught glimpses of them trying to play happy families on social media, posting pictures of barbecues or get-togethers as though nothing was wrong. I wanted to feel anger, but mostly, I felt relief. I was done. Their manipulations, their guilt trips, their blatant favoritism, they no longer had power over me. My new life began as soon as I deposited that final payment into my account. I used some of the money to buy a better car than the one they'd sold, a symbolic upgrade. I looked at it in the driveway of my apartment and felt a sense of reclaiming my dignity. I also started planning future travels, reaffirming that my life goals wouldn't be derailed by their betrayal. Their actions had forced me to stand my ground in a way I never had before. Over time, I heard rumors that my parents were struggling financially because of the settlement. They'd apparently tapped into their retirement funds to cover the costs and were scaling back their lifestyle. My sister wasn't getting her usual handouts, and that tension was splitting the family further. Some relatives asked if I'd consider forgiving them now that the money issue was resolved. But I made it clear that forgiveness wasn't on the table. They didn't just make a mistake, they made a calculated decision to exploit me, forging documents and lying without remorse until legal pressure forced them to face the truth. The betrayal went too deep for any quick reconciliation. A cousin tried to broker a family meeting, but I declined. I had no interest in listening to more excuses. My mother sent a long email blaming the stress of my sister's divorce, claiming they were desperate to cheer her up. She said they never wanted to hurt me. I never responded. My father tried calling me on my birthday, presumably to extend an olive branch, but I didn't pick up. I let it go to voicemail, where he mumbled something about wanting to move forward. Still, not one word of genuine apology, only a plea for me to stop holding on to resentment. But I wasn't resentful. I was just done. There's a difference.